Hello, thanks for joining us for a brief introduction to privacy and data protection basics. My name is Nigel May. I'm a privacy consultant with the JWT Privacy Group. My contact information is on the screen in the bottom right. You'll also see the logo LD for Logic Document International, another privacy organization, and by partnering with them, it allows us to provide privacy and data protection expertise all around the world. So, a few housekeeping items. The session is being recorded and we'll make that available after the presentation. All phones have been muted. We may have people joining during the presentation, so that will avoid distractions. Please add your questions if you have some along the way in the chat box, or feel free to hold them to the end when we will try and address all of your questions. All right, so let's begin. Privacy and data protection basics. Well, I've spent decades in operational roles in the corporate world and in government. My experience has taught me that people want to know three things: purpose, why are we speaking, the essentials, what do I need to know, and then based on that information, what actions should I be taking. We're not going to do a deep dive. That's not the intention today. What we're actually doing today is just providing you with some foundational knowledge so that you can understand the basics and realize why privacy and data protection is something that you need to care about. So let's start with purpose. You're here and we are here to talk about how to protect an individual's data rights, because it's not optional. So what are we actually talking about protecting? We're talking about personally identifiable information, or PII. That is information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity. It can be a single piece or a combination of data that, when used together, will specifically identify an individual. Sometimes this is referred to as linked or linkable data because it can be linked directly to an individual. Some examples of this are name, social security, social insurance number, date and place of birth, mother's maiden name, biometric records, which are becoming more common. So, for instance, fingerprint scans, medical, educational, financial, and employment information. So the question can get quite broad. So the thing to ask is, as an organization, do we collect, hold, or process information that can be used to specifically identify an individual? The answer to that is most likely yes. Really, all businesses will have some form of PII. And if you collect, process, or store PII, you are legally obligated to have processes and safeguards in place to protect it. So the essentials. Privacy is being free from being observed or disturbed, which really is a basic human right. Everyone has the right to have their personal information protected. That's why it's essential that before collecting personal information, every organization must get consent. So who controls the purpose, the means, and the method is often referred to as the data controller, and typically this is whoever is originally collecting the PII. And it's an important distinction because the data controller is responsible for making sure that everyone who comes in contact with that personal information, regardless of where they are or what role they fill within your organization, the data controller has to ensure that there are consistent rules applied for managing and protecting that PII. So every organization must make a reasonable effort to keep PII safe. So You really should only be collecting information that we need for the stated purpose. We should only be using it for that stated purpose. And when we no longer need it to complete that stated purpose, it needs to be disposed of completely. Every organization also needs, it's essential that they're willing and able to respond to inquiries, because any individual can contact an organization and ask to know what PII they have about them. They also want to keep personal information accurate and up to date. And the other thing an individual can inquire about is if you are storing PII, they can ask what safeguards or processes you have in place to keep it safe. So to summarize, you need to obtain consent, you need to maintain control, securely store and delete PII, and you also need to be transparent about your PII processes and safeguards. Which brings us to the actions, what you need to do. Now, privacy policy is probably the best known and the most common tool that's used toward data privacy and compliance. So it should be easy to find. Your privacy policy should be well written, clearly written, so that it's easy to understand. And essentially what you want to have in your privacy policy is you want to clearly explain what data you're collecting, what you will do with that information, and who has access to that PII. But it's not sufficient to just have a privacy policy. Every organization has to put the processes in place so they can actually do what you say you will do, what you stated in your privacy policy. So how we get there are by doing two assessments, which are also a requirement. The first is a threat assessment, and that is taking a proactive look at any risks or weaknesses that could expose PII, and that allows you to take action to reduce those risks and reduce the possibility of a breach. The impact assessment is looking at your organization to understand what would happen, what would be the impact if you suffered a breach. Again, a requirement, but also a very useful tool because it allows you to plan so that you know in advance what you will do in case a breach occurs. Now, all this responsibility falls on a data protection officer. That's the official title. It really is an individual within your organization who needs to be responsible. Now, the data protection role can be filled by a team, it can be outsourced, but ultimately within your organization there must be an individual who is responsible for creating and maintaining compliance. This information must be made public, so the public must know how to contact your data protection officer. It also should be well known within your organization so that everyone within your organization knows if there are any questions, concerns, or inquiries regarding privacy and data protection, they know where to direct those inquiries. And as a best practice, it really should be in your privacy policy, part of that clear statement. So to summarize, you need to have an informative privacy policy, conduct a risk and impact assessment, and ultimately have someone responsible for compliance and maintaining compliance within your organization. So I can't tell you that there is a solution that will keep PII 100% safe. There really isn't. The reality of the world that we live in and operate in is that anyone can suffer a breach. Regardless, we need to take reasonable steps and put in that reasonable effort to secure PII. That includes having a plan in place to deal with the breach. And we need to have someone within our organization who is responsible for compliance. So managing PII should not be a standalone activity. PII is embedded within your organization and is foundational to a lot of things that you will do. So it really should be managed within your operational processes, your data management, and your security protocols. By managing PII, you will ultimately make your business more secure, more trustworthy, more efficient. And that sounds like a pretty good return on investment. So that brings us to the conclusion of this overview. I hope that you found it informative and useful. So again, my name is Nigel May. I am with the JWT Privacy Group. You can see on screen is the link to our website. And I've also listed the contact information for myself and a couple of my colleagues, Ian and Sean, who can help me with the Q&A portion of our presentation. And just before I open it up to the floor to take questions, there were a couple of questions that I had agreed to address at the end of the presentation that had come in from people who unfortunately were not able to attend the session today. One is about GDPR, and specifically the questions that we get quite often are, why do I hear so much about GDPR? Because I thought that only applies to Europe. Well, the key question for every organization is to understand or ask themselves, where do the people that I interact with, where are they located? The location of your business does not determine the jurisdiction, the jurisdictional act for managing PII compliance. It's actually based on where the individuals are. So we can have consumers from around the world or clients from around the world. We can also have employees located outside of our immediate operating jurisdiction. We can also work with suppliers, third parties, maybe share or transfer or store data outside. So the jurisdiction is really determined by where the individual and their data is located. The other thing about GDPR is it is a gold standard. So when we work with your organization to get you into a compliant state and maintain that state, we're going to be making recommendations about best practices. And one thing about setting a high standard for that level of compliance is that it'll give you a level of comfort knowing that you are covered regardless of where those inquiries or those individuals may be located. The other thing that I want to emphasize that we have received questions about is working together. Now, being a privacy consulting group, we understand that there are some sensitive processes and, of course, some sensitive information, which is the whole purpose for us working together. So we're not here to take control or tell you what to do. We're here to provide guidance and education and assistance. So ultimately, it's your business, and you can determine how we work together, how involved you are, what roles you want us to fill. Because again, we are really here to provide the role of guidance. Right. So with that, I will stop the recording, and we will open up the floor to additional questions. Thank you for attending Privacy and Data Protection Basics.